your laptop किसी और का loud इसलिए ये सारा setup है क्योंकि मैं इधर से risk नहीं ले सकता ना जब मैं shift करूँगा तो मैं एक ही दफा करूँगा What's happening? Okay, so I don't know if let's see if we don't touch the wire. Let's see if we Shashank, you take over if this isn't working. Can you guys hear me now?
I can hear you fine. Yes, just let me know if you want me to introduce them. I'll happily do so.
Oh, no, thank you for that offer. But I think we're live and we're good. Okay, so the connection is finally working, and we're ready to roll.
Great. Okay, so we're having some technical difficulties. Sorry about this, but I'm going to temporarily take over in Musharraf's absence. I'm Shashank Joshi. I'm defense editor of The Economist, and very, very pleased to be here today for this discussion. As the least knowledgeable person on this panel in this room, it's fitting that I can take over briefly in Musharraf's absence and introduce my fellow panelists who have far greater expertise. So perhaps I could just start with Dr. Amira Jadoon, who is assistant professor at the US Military Academy at West Point. Amira, would you kick us off for a few minutes with your remarks, and then we can go on to our other panelists after that. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So everyone can hear me clearly, just to confirm?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So I'm Dr. Amira Jadoon. I'm an assistant professor at Military Academy and also a researcher at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. I think the most important and compelling question that everyone is asking is, well, do the Taliban have the willingness and capacity to restrict militant groups and deter terrorist groups from creating a base within Afghanistan? Now, this is a very important question, and I do want to spend a little bit of time laying out the different scenarios, because we have to remember early days, and all you're hearing is based on speculation, right? So to be clear, increased militancy in the country or terrorist groups planning attacks from within Afghanistan is not what the Taliban want. And they've made this clear, at least verbally. They're looking into becoming a legit entity. They're seeking political power and control. They've obviously learned from their past mistakes, and they know what they have to say to be accepted by the international community. Now, in terms of willingness, the Taliban will stay inclined to generally stay away from actively harboring terrorists. Now, whether they have the capacity to actually constrain such groups is a different story, and it's also very dependent on how the context or the situation evolves over the coming months and even years. So from my perspective, I see three possible scenarios. In each scenario, it depends whether the Afghan Taliban are actually able to contain all of these groups. So the first scenario is that violence actually escalates and there is increased resistance towards the Taliban takeover and them creating a new government. Now, again, we need to keep in mind that it's still early days and we have evidence that the Taliban have resorted to violence in some cases to squash protests, and they are facing some resistance. Now, in the event that the Taliban face even more resistance going forward, we have to keep in mind that they have strong links with groups like Al-Qaeda, the Pakistani Taliban, other Central Asian fighters as well. And we historically know that these fighters have been co-located with the Afghan Taliban members. And so if increasing violence, there will be a need for the Afghan Taliban to retain these fighters within their ranks so that they can maintain their capacity for violence. So that's one potential scenario. And we also need to keep in mind that they have not publicly disassociated themselves from any specific groups. Sure, they have mentioned that they will not allow any terrorist groups to operate, but evidence indicates that they have maintained these links, right? And logically, it makes sense for why the Afghan Taliban would be keen to retain these militants, or at least their links with these militants, because they may need them in the future. Now, the second scenario is the Taliban complete their takeover and there is not much resistance, right? Then their immediate goal is to set up a governing body. In this case, if you think about it, there's a lot that the Afghan Taliban have to do. They have to govern, they have to figure out how to rule a country, because being an insurgent group for over 20 years doesn't mean that they automatically how to country. They have to focus on the economy, provide services, also extend law enforcement across Afghanistan. And then we're wondering if they can do effective counterterrorism. I personally highly doubt that the Taliban will have full control over all regions of the country. And that has historically been a struggle for all leaders, all Afghan leaders. So in this case, even if the Afghan Taliban do not actively want to allow terrorist groups to plan and execute attacks from within Afghanistan, I'm not sure if we can realistically expect the Taliban to ensure that terrorists don't operate there, right? So what may happen is that it may not be an active sponsor of terrorism, but it may become a passive sponsor of terrorism, allowing terrorist groups just to exist, to control these groups and also extend their rule into all remote areas of Afghanistan. I just want to highlight one final scenario before I turn it over to my fellow panelists. I think the best case scenario, and perhaps now the most unrealistic scenario or unlikely scenario, is the Afghan Taliban actually form an inclusive government and engage members of the Afghan government. And obviously this doesn't have to be shallow, it has to be at a more meaningful level. In this scenario, we can expect that if the Afghan forces and the Taliban can't somehow manage to pool their resources and develop a structure for governance, then this scenario will probably be the one where they actually deter militant groups from setting up shop in Afghanistan. But again, this may also be best case scenario because a new inclusive government may be more able to establish partnerships with external countries, whether it's regional or the US, to provide them with CT support. So depending on how the situation evolves, we may see different outcomes.
Amira, thank you very much. Musharraf, are you back with us, or would you like me to keep going for a moment while we iron out the difficulties?
We've thought 4 or 5 times now that I'm back. Hi, Ibrahim. Welcome. Salam, and thank you for doing this. And thank you, Shashank. But I mean, the most important bit of feedback is that people are loving the fact that you're doing this, Shashank. So actually, maybe you should keep going. But just to throw in sort of a very minor 5-center, and maybe going back to Amita before we, go around to others, and with your permission, Shashank,
it's your show now, Musharraf. It's your show.
I heard a little bit of. You can imagine how flustered I was trying to reconnect. I heard a little bit of what you had to say, Amita. One of the things that I wanted to do right at the top was kind of introduce everyone and lay out sort of an agenda, which I think Shashank and you have already done. So I want to directly kind of go to one of the key questions that I have, which is this idea of the dynamic between Daesh or the Islamic State, Khorasan. I know they don't call it ISIS and they don't call it Daesh. But essentially, it's an extension of the wider Daesh kind of identity. We keep getting these, I don't know if assurances is the right word, but there's a sense that somehow we should be relaxed or assured that the Afghan Taliban hate Daesh so much, and Daesh hates the Afghan Taliban so much, that in and of itself, that dynamic is a guarantor of some degree of security and counterterrorism effectiveness. I wonder if you agree with that formulation, totally dismiss it, partially agree with it. What is your reaction to that framing?
That's a great question. First of all, I disagree. I don't think that because the Afghan Taliban are opposed to Islamic State Khorasan, that alone will ensure that Islamic State Khorasan will not grow, because we have a lot of evidence and we have a history of ISK, Islamic State Khorasan, has been present in the region since 2015. So it's been in the region it's survived in the region for 16 years. Now, taking a look back to 2019, through the measurement of various metrics, it seemed that ISK was in serious decline, or its operational capacity had been undermined. They experienced territorial losses, significant militant and leadership losses, no longer have control over civilians, and their attacks actually declined by almost 50% in 2019, and their lethality actually declined as well. However, this was all due to a combination of US-led missions with Afghan forces, which often coincides with ISK members. So the combination of these state-led efforts and the Taliban all acting against ISK was really critical in constraining ISK's capacity. However, since the peace talks started between the US and Afghan Taliban, we saw a significant resurgence in ISK's activity. In 2020, its number of attacks in that year alone matched their peak levels in 2017 and 2018. And there are a lot of different reasons for this. There are underlying sources of strength, such as their extensive network of alliances with some of the most lethal groups in Pakistan. They are still, they still exist very much so, such as with Lashkar-e-Jhangvi. They have access troops across both sides of the border in Afghanistan and in Pakistan as well, and their upward trend has continued into 2021. We see a slight difference in their strategy. They're stepping away from trying to control territory, but instead they have been engaging in very highly provocative attacks, targeting civilians, more sophisticated attacks. Their leader underground because of the extensive leadership decapitation they experienced. So taking all of these factors together and looking at the factors which actually undermined ISK, half of those don't exist. We do not have US air support anymore. We do not have Afghan security forces battling them. So I think we're putting a lot of expectations on the Afghan Taliban, who we must remember also have to learn how to run a country time. They didn't do a really good job the last time they attempted to do so. So I think this perception or this view that ISK, just because the Afghan Taliban is opposed to it, will not survive. They have managed to survive for about 7 years now.
I think, that is That is really valuable, and I think it gives me the perfect segue to ask Jonathan to maybe jump in and explain to a degree what it actually means, that this formulation, Jonathan, that Dr. Jadoon framed, about the existence of U.S. troops in Afghanistan combined with the Afghan army and the national security setup of the republic, combined with the competition with the Afghan Taliban. Indeed, if all of those factors were not able to reduce or eliminate, I mean, certainly there's been ups and downs, as Dr. Jadoon framed, but if it wasn't able to eliminate Daesh then, what is the likelihood of Daesh being eliminated or contained now? So kind of a similar question to the one I asked Amita, but I guess additionally, the residual capacity that the Americans have left behind, what is going to happen to that? How much of that is likely to fall into the hands of the Taliban, or is already in their control, and how much of it is kind of up for grabs? How much of it is a question mark? Jonathan?
Sure. Excellent questions. Let me start by thanking you for having me. This is a great panel. I've been looking forward to this all week, so thank you very much. On your first question, I think Amira makes a number of good points there in terms of what has kept ISIS relatively at bay in Afghanistan, though certainly unable to eliminate it from the country, and the removal of U.S. airstrikes, U.S. support to Afghan security forces, and frankly the Afghan security forces altogether, as she says, does likely create more space for ISIS, especially in sort of the eastern areas of the country. But I would also just highlight, though, that to your point about what can we expect from the Taliban going forward, right? The way the Taliban fight is very different from the way the U.S. fights and the way that the U.S. trained the Afghan army and Afghan security forces to fight, right? I mean, we as our approach to counterterrorism is a very technical one. It employs a lot of sophisticated intelligence, technical intelligence gathering mechanisms, which are then used to build strike packages on specific individuals a lot of times in order to try and minimize collateral damage and the like. And then we try to execute those as quickly as we possibly can in order to decimate the terrorist network over time. I'm not convinced that the Taliban, that their approach to counterterrorism would look anything similar to that. They know these areas very well. They're much more, I think, attuned to the local dynamics there, to the local human networks that exist. I suspect they will be able to generate much greater quantities of human intelligence than the U.S. and the Afghan security forces were in a lot of these areas. Certainly, they don't have the technical intelligence capabilities, but in a lot of ways, human intelligence is better in these types of areas. And the other thing I would say is the Taliban are, I think, much less constrained by issues like the law of armed conflict and desire, the U.S. desire, for example, to limit collateral damage, limit civilian casualties. I mean, the Taliban are a brutal organization, and I would expect them to fight the Islamic State brutally. And so I think I would expect to see the Taliban approach to the Islamic State going forward to look very different than the approach that we've seen the U.S. use and the Afghan security forces use. And it may, in some ways, be more effective for the reasons that I described. So that's one comment I would make. On your second question about, I think you were alluding to the weapons that the Taliban have captured, and and what does that mean? What can we expect from that? A few things I would say there. One is the Taliban will likely absorb a lot of the weapons that they've captured. I mean, they are now ostensibly a state government. They will, as part of that, most likely need to transform their forces from guerrilla forces into formal apparatus of the state in terms of having formal army, formal police forces, etc. And so I expect that they'll use some amount of the armory that they now have to outfit their army and their police forces. the extent to which they can maintain all of that equipment, et cetera, given especially that it was provided by the West, and depending on what happens with their government, they may or may not have access to things like spare parts, additional ammunition, et cetera. All of that remains to be seen, but at least in the short term, I mean, they've captured thousands, if not tens of thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of small arms, hundreds of howitzers and mortars, and vast stores of ammunition to go with all of that. So at least for the next few years, they should be able to effectively operate a lot of that equipment. Now, the Air Force stuff is a little bit more sophisticated, and we could talk separately about that. But the basic elements, they should be able to use that quite extensively, and I expect that they will. The other point I would make, though, is I would also expect to see a fair amount of leakage of those weapons out of Afghanistan, in part because the entirety of the country is not yet fully secured by the Taliban. These weapons are spread across, pretty much the entirety of the country. It's entirely possible that, some of these stores have fallen into hands that are not fully controlled by the Taliban, and therefore may start to smuggle these weapons out of the country. And as everybody here knows, I think that the smuggling networks that exist in this region are well established and quite vast. There are it's well known that there are weapons bazaars in the tribal regions of Pakistan, for example, where you can find all of this stuff for sale. And so I would expect to see a lot of these weapons leak out of Afghanistan, find their way into various weapons bazaars, and on their way to other theaters, whether that's in the hands of, for example, the Pakistani Taliban in Pakistan's tribal regions, to find their way into Kashmir, and I would expect eventually to start seeing these weapons appearing in other parts of the world in the hands of other terrorist groups as well. So I hope that sheds some light on your questions.
It really does. I mean, the one area you didn't mention was the degree to which there might be a worry in DC and in other places around the world that some of these weapons will also end up in Iran, and in the hands of people then who, will, like you said, I think transmit them onwards to conflicts that Iran itself is involved in or behind. So I think there's a whole range of those risks that certainly just sitting here in Pakistan that are very live and real for Pakistanis and for Pakistani national security. I want to, use that sort of that pivot to Pakistan to ask you, Ibrahim, to maybe jump in as well and maybe give us a little bit of a breakdown of what the security situation on the ground is. One kind of, and I think it's a clever formulation, but I don't think it's particularly accurate. And I want to test that with you and ask for your comments and then give us a bigger breakdown. But to me, it seems weird that there's an expectation that a group of 4,500 US soldiers, probably upwards of 1,000 or 1,500 soldiers and personnel, security personnel from other countries and embassies, NATO, non-NATO, we saw pictures of Azerbaijani and Lithuanians at some point as well. If all of them plus the Taliban put together were not able to prevent the kind of scenes that we saw, some extremely tragic at Hamid Karzai International Airport, what is realistic in terms of what we can expect the Taliban to be capable of doing? Jonathan alluded to this idea that they still don't have control, that the whole country isn't under control. I mean, I would wonder if the whole country can ever be or will ever be under the kind of command and control, sovereignty guaranteeing framework that I think a lot of Pakistanis want vis-a-vis the TTP. I think a lot of Americans and NATO countries want vis-a-vis Daesh and the Taliban's own differing friendships and differential friendships with many other problematic groups, particularly with respect to the Haqqani network. So with all of this happening, I mean, is this a serious conversation, or is the idea of counterterrorism under a Taliban regime a pipe dream that, Mullah Baradar and Akhundzada Saib and others in Doha sold effectively but have no chance of living up to as the Taliban regime kind of takes root in Afghanistan? Ibrahim.
Thank you. On the security situation, I think as far as we know, to summarize briefly, we're seeing different patches of the level of Taliban's presence and control in areas. In many of the rural areas, we're seeing a a similar type of pattern that we saw during the Taliban's insurgency. They don't necessarily have presence in every single village or every single rural area. They seem to be operating the similar kind of, if we are to call it, mobile presence, where they appear to resolve disputes or to show up and show that they're still in the area and then disappear and move on to the next area. As far as we can tell, they have set up permanent administrative presence in virtually every single district center, but they're not aiming to have that same level of permanent presence in these rural areas that the previous Afghan government was aiming for. In the urban areas, I think there's a bit more focus on those areas at this point in time. In some of the major urban centers like Herat, they initially flooded the city when they captured it, but now we're seeing that they're slowly reducing their presence. They've asked some of their fighters to go back to the districts and the rural districts around Herat from where they initially came into the city. I get the feeling that with urban centers particularly, they don't want a lot of their regular fighters to be present. I'll posit a number of reasons why that may be. Regular fighters have less discipline compared to some of the Taliban's special units, or that were formerly referred to as red units. There's more chance of disobedience. You can see there's more higher chance of revenge attacks or even theft and looting. Regular fighters also don't know how to deal with the urban constituency. These are people, in some cases, have never seen a place like Kabul, an urban modernized city. And their norms and way of dealing and governance values are very different to what the urban constituency has been used to. So I think there would be concern within the Taliban's leadership that the action of these regular fighters, if they were to continue to stay in urban centers, might antagonize this population. Lastly, I would say the Taliban for now are seem to be applying two kind of different set of rules. One to the rural areas, where it's very much more of the same, continuing with that governance that we saw during the insurgency. And with the urban centers, there seems to be a bit more effort to focus on what a modern what would be generally expected of a modern government, that includes law and order, that includes service delivery and whatnot. Just on, you mentioned Kabul, especially the tragic scenes at the Kabul airport. Before I get to the airport, let me just talk a little bit about the city itself and the security. Kabul is a huge sprawling city of estimated to be 4.4 million people. And the Taliban initially claimed that they were not planning to enter the city, but as we saw in the next day, essentially fighters started pouring into the city, and they justified that by saying that the security forces abandoned their checkpoints, and thieves and looters started presenting themselves as Taliban fighters, so they had to go in to establish law and order. Now, the Taliban is a movement that very much prides itself and is well renowned for bringing law and order, even if it's deemed draconian or repressive. It seems to have a reputation for that effective law and order establishment. In the initial days, I think so far what we're seeing is that the Taliban have been able to establish some level of law and order in the country, but in the city, but it definitely has not been what you would have expected, or what they perhaps would have imagined that they would be able to do. So right now they've brought in some of the measures they've taken is that they've brought in some of their elite forces, the creme de la crop, if we want to call it. One of the names we keep hearing is the Badri 313. The other one is the Fateh Zwak, or Victorious Force, that have been put in charge of the security in the city. There's also reports that normal Taliban fighters have been banned from brandishing weapons when they come to visit the city. The group has flooded the city with these special forces, but these are, I assume these would be some of the most effective fighters. So if the security situation around the country deteriorates, it'll be interesting to see whether the Taliban would be able to maintain the special these elite forces for Kabul's security, or they might bring in regular fighters and send these off to fight battles against any resistant forces that eventually emerge. You alluded to the Taliban's kind of approach to how they were handling. They really haven't done quite an impressive job with the crowds that are in Kabul airport. I don't know anyone that could do like an amazing job given the chaotic scenes and the thousands of people pouring into the airport. But the Taliban have definitely, I think it's one of the earliest indications how much the Taliban as a movement is focused on an insurgency fighting and how little they know about crowd control and riot control. So we're seeing very early indications. They're firing into crowds. They've got whips and sticks and belts hitting crowds, and so I think that they definitely have a long way to go before they can claim to have that policing type of discipline within their rank and file. Briefly on the topic of the expectations from the Taliban, all these different expectations, whether that's feasible or not. I think if we look at the history of Afghanistan, it's always been, up until now at least, it has been a society where the state has had to rely on different mechanisms to supplement its control. For example, at times it had to get local strongmen or local actors to allied with the state to project its state writ. At other times, it has had to rely on quasi-voluntary compliance from the citizens by really giving them freedom to decide a lot of the local level issues. And I think the Taliban, given that they don't have the capacity to build a several 100,000 or several million army, I think we'll likely have to choose some kind of a model that relies on people being compliant quasi-voluntarily, or that buys in local kind of actors to support the state's writ. Exactly what that portends for the counter-terrorism challenges that I think Dr. Jadun has already covered that, but I'll just add a few short comments. I think it's worth recalling that in the Taliban's early days, they were not really a transnational kind of Islamist movement focused on ambitions beyond Afghanistan. Its relations with Al-Qaeda developed quite by chance when they captured Jalalabad and ended up encountering a man that they perhaps would have heard a lot about during their jihad days against the Soviets. But because it was continuously spurned by international states, it started leaning more and more on that different militant groups, and to an extent that we could say it almost became dependent on them militarily and perhaps even economically. I think the Taliban of today are a lot more cognizant of the fact that international legitimacy and aid are far more conducive to the longevity of their rule than jihadist credentials. So that makes for a strong case that the movement will keep a lid on jihadist groups, or at least take actions so that if something was to happen, that they could A, argue that it took reasonable steps to prevent it, or B, have some level of plausible deniability that the attack originated from Afghanistan. Despite this, I think there are scenarios where we can imagine why the Taliban might not be willing to commit to the what they undertook under the Doha deal. One of the scenarios could be that if the Taliban-dominated government continues to come under intense international sanctions regime and again becomes a pariah state similar to the 1990s, there could be increasing pressure organizationally on it to rely on militant groups in lieu of international support and on jihadist credentials to fill the void left by lack of international recognition. Another scenario is also if some neighboring countries start supporting resistant movements within against the Taliban within Afghanistan, that they might find it increasingly attractive to utilize militant groups, regionally focused militant groups, as countermeasures against that country or state. For example, completely hypothetical, let's say Tajikistan starts supporting Masood Jr. and the Taliban are unable to suppress it. It might become increasingly attractive to let Ansarullah and other Central Asian terror groups become more operative and active in Badakhshan province in order to act as quid pro quo, I suppose, or reprisal attacks against Tajikistan. I don't think the Taliban would take such a decision lightly. I'll end on this note. I don't think they will take such a decision lightly, because they have paid a heavy price for the way they governed in the 1990s. But and this would be akin to burning all bridges with the international community, and really in the long haul kind of determining to stay as a pariah state. But I suppose it is conceivable within a certain set of conditions if they were to eventuate.
Ibrahim, that I think all of us could probably afford to just sit and continue listening to you. It's really rich and deep and insightful and worth every penny. Thank you for that. Shashank, I want to ask you to maybe comment on or frame or contextualize this last thing that Ibrahim talked about, the Taliban's global acceptance or acceptability. This is a big question, and it seemed that it was very rapid suddenly with Zalmay Khalilzad leading the charge, the Taliban's kind of normalization, the normalization of the term the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and then of course the normalization of what we're seeing over the last 8 or 9 days, which is the Taliban back in charge. We keep talking or hearing about the Taliban's thirst or hunger to have international recognition. And I think that certainly that would be the driving factor of getting them to behave in a certain way. But there are 2 or 3 early indicators that suggest that we're already well on our way to a big change in plans. If ever there were the plans, if ever the plans were that the Taliban were going to come and take over, and then the international system would use its carrots and sticks, mostly carrots, to extract more normal behavior, more internationally acceptable behavior by the Taliban regime. The IMF has frozen anything that it was going to sort of sign off on. The World Bank has suspended payments on their projects. There's a number of other indicators, including the US deciding that they're not going to process requests from the Afghanistan Central Bank. So not because you write for The Economist and are the defense editor there, but let's start with the economy. If the Taliban don't have a ready, set, go economic plan, then it seems to me that the counter-terrorism agenda, both because of being angered by the fact that they feel betrayed by this economic crunch, but also because without money and with high levels of inflation and other kinds of economic issues in day-to-day lives, the proliferation of incentives for terrorist groups to mobilize, to coalesce, and to start behaving in the way that they like to behave is going to increase. So isn't that going to press against the Taliban's desire, even if it's sincere, on the CT front?
Thanks, Musharraf. Lots of fascinating questions there, and a really brilliant set of remarks from my fellow panelists. Before I get on to that question of the economic context, let me just say a few framing comments on the militant Islamist ecosystem in Afghanistan, which I think might be somewhat useful. First of all, I think it's worth remembering that the boundaries between all of these groups are somewhat fluid. To those who are not as familiar with Afghanistan or these groups, you might think that these are sort of hermetically sealed, self-contained organizations with their corporate identity completely exclusive. And we know that's not the case, right? We see lots of examples of that. A very good example being Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, in a branch of Al-Qaeda core. and membership overlaps a great deal. Similarly with members of the TTP and Al-Qaeda, and we know the Haqqani network, whose leader is a deputy leader of the Taliban, is also a hub for lots of this activity between Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So the boundaries between these groups are blurry, and they are melded by ties, not just by ties of ideology, but by ties of kinship, marriage, history, and personal relationship going back for many years. And if we try and think about jihadist activity in Afghanistan as being a number of these, like football teams competing against each other or sort of operating at arm's length with the Taliban as the referee, I think that's a mistake. So just to sort of help us frame that. The second point is that let's remember there are lots of unaffiliated jihadists in Afghanistan. International jihadists. So if you look at the recent reports by the UN panel on monitoring sanctions for Al-Qaeda and Daesh, they put the figures of foreign jihadists in Afghanistan at about 10,000, I think. Someone will correct me if I'm mistaken about that. The figures for ISKP are about 2,000, and the figures for Al-Qaeda, at least in the earlier reports, not the most recent one, but I think are a few hundred, several hundred. That leaves a huge number of unaffiliated foreign fighters. And I think that's hugely complicates the picture because it means the Taliban can't deal with them in the same way they can deal with a centralized, disciplined organization in the manner of Al-Qaeda core, but it's a much more messy, diffuse, vociferous system. What does that mean for the Taliban's ability to maintain control of this activity in a country in which the National Directorate of Security is dissolved, in which members of the NDS will have fled, in which the intelligence apparatus will essentially have to be reconstituted, although the Taliban have their own intelligence apparatus. It's one that's been configured for insurgency rather than national control, national counterterrorism. Thirdly, the position of Al-Qaeda core is different to what it was 20 years ago, right? This isn't just a return to 2001. We're seeing a system in which groups in the Middle East, in the Sahel, in the Arabian Peninsula, are much more powerful and capable, including capable of operational plotting against Western targets, which is the bit that, where I'm sitting here in the UK is the bit where counterterrorism officials worry about. Those are much more capable than they were 20 years ago. And the relative position of Al-Qaeda core's leadership in Afghanistan has declined. And that also makes a difference. It means in some ways that Al-Qaeda can also afford to be more patient, which I think the Taliban will be encouraging it to be, to lie low, to be cautious, to maintain a more prudent posture, not to lash out in ways that has an immediate backlash to the Taliban leadership at this moment of extreme diplomatic sensitivity. Okay, now all of that kind of brings us to the point that you began with, Musharraf, which was the question of global acceptability, and how the Taliban is balancing all of this. And this comes back to some points that I think Amira made at the beginning. The Taliban have a real balancing act here. Al-Qaeda members and personnel have been important contributing parts of their fighting force and their military capability, and cracking down or aggressively trying to push back at that would have political consequences for the Taliban's coherence at a time when they're undergoing extreme flux, when you have, a clear sort of people trying to establish the balance of power between the political leadership and the military commanders, in which different regional groups within the Taliban are also vying for influence. So that balance between maintaining that coherence and maintaining those relationships on the one hand, and mollifying international partners, not just the West, but also Russia, China, Iran, and to some extent Pakistan, is an incredibly difficult balancing act. How does the economic picture feed into this? Well, let me say at the outset, despite the title of my magazine, I'm about as far from an expert on economics as you can get. But I have been interested in this in recent days because of the as we saw at the G7 meeting yesterday, the very clear sense that Western countries want to seek to use economic factors as leverage against the Taliban. When Boris Johnson spoke about this immediately after the G7 meeting, and was talking about the huge political, diplomatic, and economic leverage that the G7 had. And he was asked, what did he mean by this? He immediately pointed to the frozen reserves, which I think are about $7 billion or so held in New York, which the Biden administration has frozen. And on top of that, there are the multilateral institutions funding. We see the World Bank has paused disbursements today. The IMF has also limited disbursements. Now, the question is, to what extent are those economic measures designed as kind of efforts to cut loose the Taliban completely? And to what extent are they bargaining chips designed to secure more effective forms of behavior? Because if they are maintained, if this is purely an effort to isolate and contain the Taliban regime and punish it with no kind of give or take, it will have profound economic consequences within Afghanistan. From my own conversations with experts on the Afghan economy this morning, I'm absolutely convinced that the result will be cataclysmic if that's the case, and extremely bad for all of these outcomes. But I think what we saw very clearly from Boris Johnson's remarks and from other G7 leaders is that these are bargaining chips, and these are intended to secure pliant behavior initially on refugees and evacuation, then after August 31st on the continued emigration of vulnerable Afghans who want to leave the country, and then furthermore on issues such as women's rights, broader human rights, and on counter-terrorism. And I think the challenge is going to be two things. One of them is how you calibrate this leverage in sort of careful ways, because of course once you release several $1 billion in reserves, which is sufficient to pay for your imports for quite a long time, you immediately lose lots of that leverage. So how do you calibrate it in a cautious and careful way? Because lots of these things are long-term, right? Counterterrorism is a long-term issue that is going to be an issue with the Taliban leadership in a year's time or 2 years' time, whereas refugees and emigration will be a intense, acute issue for the next several months, and then will fade in the Western consciousness very quickly after that. But the other question is, how do you maintain coherence among the international community? And here I think you have a question of the unity of the G7 itself, because my sense is that European countries are much more willing to try and think about how you pragmatically deal with the Taliban than the US administration is, given their own concerns around refugee flows to Europe. That's my initial impression, and it could be wrong. I may have misread this, and we'll get a clearer picture in the weeks that follow. And the second question is, beyond the G7, what does the engagement from China, Russia, Iran, and indeed Pakistan to the Taliban mean for the G7 and the West's ability to use that leverage and the effectiveness of that leverage? And are they overestimating it in ways that may mean it is less effective than they think? So I'll stop there and hand back to you.
Thanks, Shashik. Again, as always, really insightful, especially your original framing of it, because that's really a question I wanted to take both to Jonathan and to Amita. Let's start with you, Dr. Jadoon. For many years, the kind of big picture macro analysis on the terrorism that Pakistan faced was that at a certain point in time, the LEJ, sorry, I wanted to get that right because there's so many LEs, but the LEJ had become kind of a network operator that facilitated it was like a Walmart. It was a moving, walking, talking Walmart of terrorism capability. And various other groups would come and plug and play with the LEJ, and the TTP was its largest client. But there was these kind of moving relationships, networks layered upon other networks in which people were cooperating and collaborating, much in the way that I think Mr. Joshi just framed for us. If that sort of framing holds true even to a marginal degree, then the idea somehow, again, starting with the TTP, because that's really of urgent importance, not just for Pakistan, but I think also for China, especially given the last month and a half where we've seen some spectacular attacks on Chinese targets on Pakistani territory, and we've seen a ramping up of Chinese rhetoric and responsiveness to that. If the network approach is the way these groups operate, then the assumption or the prediction or I don't know, maybe the gullibility of folks in Doha from many, many countries to the idea that the Taliban can help deliver a kind of CT equilibrium is it not unrealistic and fictional, or is there more to this that we might be missing, Dr. Jadoo?
All right, thank you. Just to note, I think your voice broke off in a little places, but I got the gist of your question. Just to reiterate, I completely agree about the fact that militant membership in these groups, which exist in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region, is very fluid. And another thing which has made it really fluid is, and this is something that we're seeing across South Asia, Southeast Asia, is there is a greater fusion of these transnational groups, primarily Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, and local groups such as Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, which has always cooperated with other groups, and many others, even the IMU, they have always cooperated. They've had motivations to join forces, to pool their resources, to share expertise and know-how to achieve their own goals. And where we see that their ideology and agenda converges to a significant level, we may even see deeper alliances, right? And the problem with these networks, especially the fusion of transnational and local groups, there's at least two main implications for terrorism in general in the region. One is whenever these groups, local groups, link up with transnational brands, we can see that there is an influence on their capacity, on the tactics that they use. They tend to use more extreme tactics, and they also become more innovative. And there's a really rich body of research which shows that once these alliance hubs form, they have the capacity to endure really difficult circumstances. And one of the problems in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, and even beyond, is the inability of governments to actually dismantle these networks. They have more links to the local black markets. They can also extort civilians more effectively. They can engage in smuggling, etc. So this network, which has emerged in Afghanistan, Pakistan, not only makes membership more fluid, which is a challenge for counterterrorism, and ethnically they're also they overlap. It's just really difficult for governments to figure out how to dismantle these. And another additional problem is the porous borders, right? The most notable one is between Afghanistan and Pakistan. What this does is that when governments are not cooperating, and in fact, they tend to blame each other, this allows militants to escape a lot of efforts against them, which then allows them to re-emerge and regroup when the timing is right. We're seeing this, we saw this with Islamic State Khorasan. We will likely see this with Al-Qaeda, which still has affiliates across South Asia, and they are linked. The additional threat here is that Islamic State and Al-Qaeda both have affiliates across South Asia of varying capacities. And if these affiliates start linking up and cooperating, kind of like what we've seen Islamic State Khorasan do in Pakistan and Afghanistan, this is a real problem. I sort of going back to the first point, which I expectations on the Afghan who basically still have to figure out how to run a country, and a country which is Afghanistan, which is, we know historically has been difficult to govern, especially the remote areas. If you look at the example of Pakistan, which has a strong military and a stronger government than its neighbor, it still struggles to extend full control over some of the remote regions, and it hasn't been able to expel all of the militants due to the various reasons that I've highlighted. So I think what we really need going forward is to create regional CT hubs, which also brings in China, Russia, Pakistan, because despite great power competition and divergent state level interests, the one thing which is in common is counterterrorism, right? So both Pakistan and China, they want peace in Afghanistan, even if that's just for greater regional connectivity and development, etc. Russia and China are also aligning, and they are reaching out to the Afghan Taliban. So sort of the glimmer of hope is that if these regional countries are encouraged also by the US to sort of develop this regional CT hub, and then these countries have good relations with the Afghan Taliban. I think that's the one way where we can expect the Afghan Taliban to conduct any effective counterterrorism. What everyone, I think, generally is looking to is, oh, wow, they were a really great insurgent group. They survived. They were able to engage in a peace deal with the U.S. The U.S. withdrew conditional. The Afghan government surrendered. This doesn't mean that the Afghan Taliban know how to govern the state and provide services, protect civilians, ensure human rights, and then also take on this problem of counterterrorism in a region which is one of the most military regions in the world. So it's not just the Afghan Taliban who will struggle. Other governments in the region also struggle to contain terrorist activity in the region. So I lean towards sort of what you said. Your perspective is that we're placing a lot of expectations on the Afghan Taliban, where the only thing we have really any evidence of is them being an effective insurgent group with limited control over civilians. So I think they will be dependent on some level of external support if they are to engage in effective CT.
Absolutely, no, that's really helpful, Jonathan. And you've written about this and spoken about it, I think, at reasonable length as well. But if that's the sort of point of departure, and we already know from research, not only yourself but many others have done on how all of this went down. Whatever's happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks, or 2 or 3 months, or even 2 or 3 years. One of the preferred modes of engaging for the Taliban is deal making. They like to make deals. That's really how they've taken over. It's been less of a spectacular military victory and more of a really surprising, almost shocking series of political deals. Again, if we drag that and kind of force feed it into the processor of CT, and we think about what the Taliban are likely to do to try and enact a reasonable and robust counterterrorism regime in which they can at least turn around and say to Washington and London and other G7 powers, look, guys, we promised we wouldn't let this happen, and we're not letting this happen. How much of that are they likely to pursue through deal making? And because they're going to pursue it through deal making, so there's a second follow-on question, how likely is it that some oxygen will be left? And that oxygen might be, to China's chagrin, it might be ETIM, to Pakistan's it might be TTP, to Iran's it might be Lashkar-e-Jhangvi or anti-Shia or anti-Hazara groups. What is there going to be a version of this? Is it likely that there's any version of this that leads to a really robust full spectrum CT? Or is the result of their deal making going to be that, we'll see this kind of in fits and starts? Sometimes they'll be stronger on one, weaker on the other, and then they'll just keep circulating and making deal after deal, rather than maybe what they might do with the IS Khorasan, which is to actually fight them full on. Jonathan?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll start by saying, if there's one thing I've learned over the last few months, it's to be wary about making predictions. So let me not couch what I'm going to say as a prediction of sorts, but rather I will take as a going in assumption what you described, which is the Taliban preference for deal making, which I do think is at least an accurate description of how they came to power here. If you take that as an assumption going forward and assume that they'll continue to behave in that way, both internally and externally, which is to say to prioritize political tracks with various entities, I think where that takes you logically is from an internal perspective. I think both Amira and Ibrahim commented that they're unlikely, the Taliban are unlikely to go pick fights with all of these different groups at the same time, especially as they're trying to consolidate control over the country, trying to form a government, trying to form formal security forces that can act in support of being a formal government. The last thing, and especially with this sort of rump resistance that may or may not continue to exist emanating out of Panjshir, the last thing they're going to want to do is to, create a whole bunch of rear guard battles that they have to fight with various terrorist and sort of rump insurgent groups within or across Afghanistan. So I would expect, again, sort of relying on your assumption, to see a number of sort of deals being cut between the and these groups that may or not. I mean, they may be temporary arrangements of convenience that the Taliban eventually change their mind on, or the groups themselves change their mind on, depending on how conditions evolve. But again, the Taliban cannot afford to have a whole bunch of groups starting to conduct terrorist attacks against itself, or forming nascent insurgencies in various parts of the country in the immediate future. So I think it makes sense that they would seek to negotiate, some amount of tacit, acquiescence, at least by some of these groups, to Taliban power now. But looking externally, right, there are, as all of the panelists have highlighted, there are counterterrorism concerns amongst many different countries, all of the regional countries, but also the likes of China and Russia, et cetera, in Afghanistan. The interesting thing here, though, is those interests don't all squarely align, right? Which is to say that each of these countries has specific groups that it cares most about. I mean, China, for example, cares most about the Turkestan Islamic movement and perhaps less so about Al-Qaeda. Obviously, the U.S. is most concerned about Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. Pakistan's probably most concerned about the Pakistani Taliban. So, and while these groups are not distinct, right, as Shashank mentioned, they nonetheless, right, have some amount of independence to them, that each of these countries are we're talking to the U.S. about the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda, et cetera, right? It provides maneuver space politically for the Taliban to try and divide and conquer the other countries of the region and the world when it comes to negotiating various, carrots that they might want in response to taking action against one or more of these groups, or at least, trying to hold them at bay. And so I think Amir sort of, made a comment in passing that I think is really something worth exploring more broadly, which is the idea of an international agreement on engaging the Taliban with respect to counterterrorism. One in which the U.S. would, presumably not be the lead actor, but would be one of many countries that would meet separately, formulate a coherent and comprehensive policy on counterterrorism that the international community could then go to the Taliban and present collectively, right? That would address the concerns of all of the countries with respect to terrorism in Afghanistan, and would do it in a way that doesn't allow the Taliban to play countries off of each other, and to sort of divide and conquer based on those countries' individual counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan. And that's a really interesting idea. It would take a lot of work diplomatically to bring it together. But at least on its face, it's something that I'm glad Amir raised it. And I would love to see that explored in more depth.
Well, that's a good. That's a good sort of. I think that's a really good idea, but I guess maybe Ibrahim, you can speak to this in terms of what your own understanding and reading is of the Taliban's behavior so far as its relationship, in particular, when we try to frame the Taliban's relationships with various countries, particularly I would say Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia, in the context of maybe defining or trying to frame a wider alignment or coalition or compact that is focused on counterterrorism. Are the incentives there for those countries to get along more, or is it more of the same? Jonathan already alluded to it, right? This idea that the Taliban, I think, have become very adroit at figuring out what each country in the region and beyond that wants from them, and then engaging with those countries in that vertical and having a separate relationship with the other country in their vertical. there's a lot of arbitrage that the Taliban have benefited from, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. I'm going to take a similar question in the context of the G7 and the Americans and the EU and the wider Western powers to Shashank. But maybe, Ibrahim, you could talk a little bit about how the Taliban is seen within Afghanistan, but also by researchers and analysts like yourself in terms of this arbitrage opportunity and how long they can continue without running into problems. And again, for me, the first and primary one obviously is the economics, but where there's an economic problem, especially in a resource-constrained country, counter-terrorism problems will not be far behind. Ibrahim.
Thank you. I think it's, as Dr. Shorten mentioned, it's definitely something that's worth exploring and has a lot of potential. I'm assuming that the US would have tried to have a broad-based international unified front when they were negotiating with the Taliban during the intra-Afghan talks phase, and they will continue to try to do that. But I think we're already seeing some there was a level of international unity. For example, the UN Security Council, as late as after the Doha deal 2020, made a statement saying that they will not recognize a return of the emirate, which is quite significant in today's international relations context, where we're increasingly going towards a multipolar kind of world order, and it's hard to get the permanent five to agree on anything. To get a statement like that was a strong intention out, and how much the international community is concerned about the emirate based on their past behavior in the 1990s. But we never really, it never reached the level that many analysts, including myself, were advocating for in terms of a unified front on how to negotiate with the Taliban. And I think more recently, as the Taliban has made more gains and has now is in de facto control of the country, there's potential we might actually see the international front, that unified front breaking, and each state kind of pursuing their own narrower interests. The fact that President Biden had a meeting with the G7, which doesn't include Russia, China, or any of the other major regional countries like Pakistan, India, etc., was a strong indication that maybe we are seeing different countries thinking differently on how they want to approach and deal with the Taliban. It is a big challenge, and they will, people will have different ideas on how they want to engage and influence the movement's behavior. I just want to point out in terms of, from the Taliban's perspective, how they will approach any attempts at counter-terrorism negotiations and controlling these groups. The Taliban's primary concern will not be, it will be maintaining its cohesion. I think the Taliban is a movement almost singularly fixated on the idea of maintaining its cohesion, because for a long time NATO's strategy was splitting the movement. I think there's also that has raised this the specter of fragmentation as a very important consideration for the movement, and that's why that explains why the movement has never really made strong military, hasn't really taken military action against whether it's terror groups that are a separate entity, or whether it's their own members who are causing trouble within the rank and file. So it's important to, when we are making demands of the Taliban, I think it's always important how they view it in the framework of how that could impact the movement's cohesion, and whether it could lead to fragmentation. Just very briefly, I'll just add the final comment, because as the international community will be talking about CT and more broadly how to influence the Taliban's behavior, we are going to more and more hear the terms sanctions, aid, international recognition. I would say so far it seems like these are used indivisibly, like you have to use the whole package, and the Taliban has to do X, Y, Z, and then we will give them all this. But it's important to know, for example, sanctions are actually a legal obligation on on all member states, because there is blanket UN Security Council resolutions requiring asset freezing, requiring arms embargoes. So these are legal obligations that don't always necessarily indicate a policy decision by any government. And it's also worth recalling that if any government wants to get off of that, they will need international buy-in. They will need the Security Council to remove that resolution. No single country can kind of signal, say, we will get rid of this because it's not within there. They can remove domestic legislation, but they can't necessarily remove the Security Council resolutions unless there is broader buy-in from the P5 and other members in the Security Council. But it's worth thinking about whether we want to use sanctions as a have separate conditions for sanctions, and the implications of sanctions kick in. As I said, the country could become a pariah state, and what kind of ramifications that has for regional security and more broader humanitarian patterns or migration trends, etc. The other issue is economic aid. Again, that's a whole different ballgame. The previous government, 75% of their public expenditure was dependent on foreign aid grants, so there is room to use that. But again, do you want to use that for core? We really have to think about the effectiveness of aid as a leverage, and where would it prove effective and where it wouldn't. And international recognition, again, you really have to kind of, there is a possibility to use them separately and independently and contingent on different factors, rather than necessarily as you're going to become a pariah state unless you do X, Y, Z.
So Ibrahim, I think, yeah, no, thank you. And I think, again, perfect segue for Shashank. Shashank, what is the likelihood of a Biden administration that has taken an enormous beating, a beating of the kind that, frankly, I don't think in terms of its intensity, at any point the Trump administration had to take? There's been a universal sort of almost condemnation of the manner of the retreat or the withdrawal or the exit. And there's also been, concurrent with that, not just an anger at the way this has gone down, but an anger at what it has left behind, which is an Afghanistan that is run by the Taliban. With everything going on, is there any chance at all that the political circumstances in DC would allow for the Biden administration to remove sanctions and to make economic engagement with Afghanistan easier? It seems to me that the worst case scenario that Ibrahim kind of pointed towards is already the proactive reality. The reality is that it seems, again, there's a question, but it's a rather insistent, an insistent kind, which is, I just don't see any way that the Biden administration is going to be able to unlock the IMF money, to send USAID delegations, to free up either grant or loan money from any of the international institutions to a Taliban regime that, no matter what it does, will continue to be defined by the term that you used for the whole alphabet soup of different groups, including the Taliban, that dominate the Afghan landscape. If that's the case, then maybe this whole conversation is moot anyway, because we're headed towards a Afghanistan that is very similar in terms of its pariahness to what we had between 96 and 2001. Shashank.
It's fascinating. I think Ibrahim's completely correct that the UN Security Council is a very important locus of this, because, of course, it's the only forum that has the power to delist sanctioned members, and therefore that requires the assent of Russia and China. And it includes also, by the way, let's not forget the influence of other members of the Security Council, a body that's currently chaired by India, which has its own strong and particular perspective on these issues and its own concerns around the role of terrorist groups in Afghanistan. But having said that, I think we also need to reflect on the politics of this in the United States. The Trump administration initiated open talks with the Taliban. Its Secretary of State, an American Secretary of State, posed alongside Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, a co-founder of the Taliban, and an individual who was, only a short period before that thrown into jail at the behest of the CIA and ISI, and helped pressed the Afghan government to release many thousands of prisoners, including many of whom have came back to bite the erstwhile Afghan state on its backside. And I wouldn't say it suffered a particularly egregious domestic backlash to that. And the Trump administration as well has managed to do some things that even a few years ago I think we would have sat back and thought, can they really do this? We've just seen a CIA, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, traveling to Kabul to talk to Baradar. We have seen a head of CENTCOM, a competent commander of the United States, go and meet Taliban representatives in Doha. The level of engagement, open public engagement, and open acknowledgement by the United States that it is coordinating with the Taliban. I saw Jen Psaki, the White House spokesperson, yesterday say the success of the mission will depend on coordination with the Taliban. Openly saying that. I think that's extraordinary and suggests that there is a kind of latitude in the US to make these trade-offs in the interest of a withdrawal and securing American interests. And I think it's not going to be particularly hard for a Biden administration to point out that counterterrorism is the overarching interest in the country. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't think that the US is necessarily going to take a dogmatic position on these issues and be unable to show flexibility on this. But I would say that we're going to see a number of other sort of tricky things, which is we've spoken a lot about counterterrorism. That's the subject of our panel today. But what if we're in a situation where we have the G7 or a contact group, as Boris Johnson suggested, and touching on some of the ideas of a multinational forum that we've raised here, says we can make these concessions on unlocking reserves or on unlocking these financial flows in exchange for tangible commitments on counterterrorism on a number of groups. Now, what happens if India says, well, what about Lashkar-e-Taiba? We'd like to see some specific measures on that. And the G7 says, well, yeah, okay, Lashkar-e-Taiba is a problem, but look, that's a marginal issue. We're much more interested in AQ and ISKP. You're going to have to stick Lashkar-e-Taiba out to the side. International unity on these issues is going to be very hard to achieve, and consensus is only going to be found, in my view, on a pretty small cluster of these, the main cluster of these groups. And then you're going to have constituencies and voices that say very, very clearly, no, we should not be unlocking these financial flows purely for counterterrorism. That is cynical. We need to be ensuring we have tangible progress on women's rights and women's education, on girls' schools, on an inclusive government. And it's going to be a Christmas tree. People will be hanging baubles and things off these requirements, by the dozen. So I think it's going to be incredibly hard to maintain international consensus on what we want to see from the Taliban. And ultimately, I think the US and a small number of other actors, including the Russians, the Chinese, and others, are going to be the ones whose voices are heard most loudly, and is their priorities on counterterrorism that the Taliban will ultimately pay heed the most. But I welcome disagreement on that if others think I'm wrong.
No, it's hard to disagree. Well, I'll speak for myself and maybe ask others to jump in if they do disagree. But I wanted to, since the topic was and is CT, I think it would be unfair for our viewers or listeners to not hear some more detailed analysis from all of you, specifically on the TTP. Shashank, you mentioned the LAT as an India concern. I think the primary and principal driver of Pakistani CT concern is, of course, Al-Qaeda and ISK, but above all things, it's the TTP. Now, I'm not 100% sure that, like we've already discussed in some length, that these lines are clear across, what is TTP and what isn't. But the TTP, in terms of what it seeks to do and what it's looking to do, and the early signs of at least confusion, if not outright sort of step back, casual chill from the Doha Shura, which is now the government or at least the government in waiting in Kabul. Maybe I'll start with you, Dr. Jadoon. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about this TTP issue and what you think is likely to happen. Is the TTP likely to evaporate thanks to the Afghan Taliban, as I think certainly many Pakistanis and certainly many Pakistani decision makers are hoping?
Yeah, so I actually did very recently released a pretty extensive report on the TTP. I think if you take a step back, there were some increase in attacks by TTP, mostly low-scale clashes with the army. Nothing. We haven't really seen anything large-scale. But there are a few factors which have raised concerns about the Pakistani Taliban. One, that the group still exists, although a large portion of its members exist within Afghanistan, but we don't really have a good grasp of how many sleeper cells the TTP has maintained in urban areas. We know that when Pakistan conducted operations in their northwest regions, a lot of Pakistani Taliban militants dispersed throughout the urban centers, and also that's where they were launching attacks. Now that the Afghan Taliban has emerged as victorious, we know that the Pakistani Taliban have actually, in their propaganda, made a concerted effort to show how they contributed to the Afghan Taliban's victory, and are very much they're very much trying to show their deep connection with the Afghan Taliban for various reasons, but one of the main reasons is that it gives them added legitimacy. The Pakistani Taliban also has a very close relationship with Al-Qaeda, which it has maintained over years, and actually this relationship was really mutually beneficial. So coming back to present day, the reason why there have been some concerns is that we have seen a slight uptick in attacks. I like to remind everyone that we have to look at what we're seeing now in terms of the magnitude of attacks based on what Pakistani Taliban as a group was doing in its peak years, 2010, 12, etc. So the uptick is very small and it's very concentrated in a few regions in Waziristan, etc. There have attempts to extort civilians. There have been attempts to intimidate civilians, asking them not to go out or imposing restrictions on women. Now, the key question is, will the Pakistani Taliban, which has a new leader, which has brought in other groups into its fold, it's increased its propaganda output, and it's also has strong relationships with the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda. So these are the factors which can allow the Pakistani Taliban to reemerge and really try and make a comeback. I think what some of the other factors which have sort of worked against it in previous years is leadership decapitation of the Pakistani Taliban, which was supported by US drone strikes. Really, the organization was very not very coherent internally, and there was a lot of infighting. We see that once the leadership returned to the Masood tribe, they have focused on building this coherence. So if the TTP is able to maintain this internal coherence, it's attempting to stay away from targeting civilians because that was very costly for it politically. And if it's able to continue to leverage its relationship with the Afghan Taliban and Al-Qaeda, even if it may not be very obvious and on the surface, I think those are some of the factors which can allow the Pakistani Taliban to make a comeback. The other piece of this puzzle is that there are a lot of deep grievances in the northwest regions, the Fatah regions. And of course, this has been brought to the KPK, the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, but real reforms are still an issue. And we have the example of PTM where the Pakistani government hasn't really responded in a way which it should, right? So if there are genuine grievances in these areas and they're not being addressed, that creates recruitment opportunities for Taliban. So there's a combination of factors which we have to keep an eye on. So it's not guaranteed, I would say at this point, that the Pakistani Taliban is definitely going to make a comeback because it still has a lot of internal issues which it has to overcome. And also the string of the Lahrar, Hezbollah.
We suddenly lost, at least I
is
lost.
not a coherent group.
Got it. Thanks, thanks, Dr.
Can you hear me
Zadoun.
now?
Yeah. I think we heard enough to make out what you said. Thank you for that. I want to continue on the interests, the Pakistan angle of this whole equation. Dr. Schroden, I wonder if you have any thoughts on not just the TTP itself, but Pakistan also has concerns around some of the separatist terrorist groups that are focused on Balochistan that are claimed to have been operating out of Afghanistan. There's reasonable, I think, evidence that at least in some cases was true. Certainly, there's links through it onto those groups as well. But if the space is managed in the way that we've discussed so far, then again, what incentive does or how do the incentive structures for the Taliban work? With all the different demands on the Taliban for different kinds of behavior, how will the Taliban try and ensure that each of those demands or requests or expectations are met? And I think particularly with both the TTP and the BLA type groups, the concern is not just that those are concerns for Pakistan, but that increasingly, Amira mentioned that there's the TTP hasn't been that active, and that's absolutely correct. But I think in the last month, there's been 2 strikes against Chinese targets, and that has actually raised the profile of the TTP substantially. What is the likelihood that any of this is going to come to an immediate halt, a gradual halt, or whether there's a likelihood that some of this will increase and the Taliban will try and play off different groups against each other and see to it that it can afford to anger some of its neighbors and regional powers more than others?
Yeah, again, excellent questions. I mean, these are very, very complicated dynamics, as I think the other panelists have alluded well to in their remarks. And I would be, it would be foolish of me to try to pretend to understand those dynamics or to be able to analyze them, especially in such a short time, to provide, a really, really strong predictive answer here. I'll just highlight a couple of factors that may be worth thinking about that could come into play. One is, to your point about there's been accusations from the Pakistani state, from various officials and other folks in Pakistan for years about the Pakistani Taliban supposedly having safe havens inside Afghanistan, potentially even receiving support from what was the Afghan Intelligence Service, the National Directorate of Security, as sort of a retributive action against Pakistan for its support to the Afghan Taliban. And obviously the Afghan Intelligence Service, the NDS, doesn't exist, at least formally, anymore. And so it'll be interesting to see to what extent the absence of the NDS from the playing field now has any implications whatsoever for the Pakistani Taliban. I mean, it was never clear to me that this, if there was support being provided by the NDS to the Pakistani Taliban, that it was particularly significant or even decisive in terms of that group's, the Pakistani Taliban's ability to do anything. But nonetheless, I think that'll be an interesting sort of factor to pay attention to. Another will be, as we discussed earlier, if the Taliban find themselves in a position where, let's say, some type of international consensus isn't formed and presented to them on counterterrorism, and the Taliban find themselves in the position to sort of be wheeling and dealing with individual countries relative to their interests. I mean, of all of the countries that could come to them and say, we have demands that we want to be met when it comes to counterterrorism, it seems to me that Pakistan would be in, arguably the strongest position there, given both its long history with the Taliban, all of the support that it provided the organization, and while it's not a truly sort of brotherly feeling between the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani state for a whole variety of reasons, there is nonetheless this sort of long shared history and relationships there on which one could draw. But even beyond that, geopolitically, I mean, Pakistan is a powerful neighbor that exists on its border. It is, a very large Muslim country that could rally much of the Muslim world to support the Afghan Taliban if it chose to do that. It is arguably the most obvious route for the Afghan state to have, export capability to the ocean and therefore to the rest of the world, which creates its own sort of economic incentives for the now Taliban government. So there's a whole host of things that Pakistan could bring to bear that are much more immediate and lasting for the Taliban government than the types of things that the U.S. or the West might be able to bring from much farther afield.
That's great, Dr. Schroden. By the way, we're approaching our kind of generally set 90-minute timeline, and I feel like we've just scratched the surface, and all of you have so much more that I can learn from, and I'm sure everybody watching can as well. We'll wrap up shortly, but I did want to say, Pakistan's experience with Afghanistan is that, the people that aren't in charge in Kabul, when they're not in charge, they seem very amenable to Pakistani sort of, seduction, if you will. But as soon as they're in charge in Kabul, they seem to be much more Afghan and much more independent and autonomous. Certainly, all of the factors you mentioned were powers or advantages Pakistan had over the last 20 years as well, and it certainly wasn't able to leverage those in the direction that it wanted. But obviously, there's a different context with the absence of U.S. and NATO ISAF troops. I want to go to both Mr. Joshi and Mr. Bahis, but I also wanted to just, out of respect for some of the comments, just read out some things, and I'll leave it to you if you want to react to any of them. Suleiman Ishaq asked, I guess he was asking me why I would drag the Afghanis in this. They only fought foreign invaders. They're nothing like Daesh or ISIS. Okay. And also he said, if the Taliban don't lie casually, why would you doubt their promises? Again, obviously, I don't have an answer, but if anybody wants to comment on that. Jawad Amin said the world has changed, but not the Afghan society. Well, Jawad is not a fan of Afghan society for some reason. Amit Nagpal asked a question about whether the flow of terrorists from Afghanistan to Indian-occupied Kashmir will materialize, or will the FATF sword, so to speak, dominate? And Joseph McGloyer, I think, is asking a question about the G20, and that's a great segue for me to maybe pose a question to Shashank. Then, for a quick response and reactions to any of those comments, then I'll go to you, Ibrahim, and then we'll end with you, Dr. Jadoon, and finally we'll go to Dr. Shorten. So, real quick, Shashank, on any of those, but also on the question of Jean Arnault, because when he was appointed by the UN Secretary General, it didn't seem, given that Zalmay Khalilzad was doing his thing, that he would have a lot of traction with some of the ideas we've discussed here. You mentioned G7. Joseph has commented with questions about the G20. It seems to me the best venue and the best individual for that job is already it's the UN and it's Jean Arnault. But are you optimistic about that kind of possibility, or is it going to continue to be run kind of with ad hoc regional blocks, forming, reforming, shaping, and reshaping?
Yeah, so much of what we see in the world today, isn't it, is this sort of sense of multiple ad hoc coalitions all trying to get at the problem from different ways, right? We see this in Asia with institutions like the Quad, ASEAN, other fora, jostling against each other. The days of just the G7 running the show, if ever those days were even there, those are done. And in Afghanistan, which is a place where some states have surprisingly outsized influence, the G20 is going to be very important, right? The Gulf states are clearly very important. The Qatari ambassador has been personally ferrying Americans and other individuals into the airport, and Qatar is in an extremely interesting and pivotal position at this stage. So those sorts of forums are going to be very, very important. But I think, just if I can reflect on something, we spent so much of this time thinking about all the leverage the outside world has and the various levers it can pull. And we spent a little bit of time thinking about the Taliban's calculus. And while they undoubtedly have changed and have learnt from the experience of the past 20 years and from the world around them, and they face, contrary to what your question has said, an Afghan society that has dramatically changed in 20 years, no doubt about it. We still don't know where their leadership will ultimately come down on these trade-offs, right? We don't know whether ultimately the inducement, the carrots, the sticks, all of these things, even the pressures from within Afghan society, will be enough to fundamentally change their calculus, or whether they will accept the costs, they will accept the isolation, they will accept the diplomatic marginalization in exchange for a more inward-looking, more defensive crouch, with focused on bilateral ties with a very small number of patrons and supporters. That question we just don't have the answer to right now. And so ultimately, you know, I am more, I think, of a pessimist that any organization, any forum, let alone, you know, G20, G7, is going to be able to induce a long-term change in the Taliban's behavior on any of these numbers. And I think, you know, for all of the good ideas we've discussed, an international agreement on counterterrorism to present a united front, I think we're going to see a great deal of unilateral action against Afghanistan by the big powers in the next several years. That's my hunch.
Thanks, Shashank. Ibrahim, any response to any of the comments or any sort of final thoughts, a response maybe to Shashank's formulation? I'd love to get your views on what you think the likelihood of Jean Arnault sort of being able to mobilize something that will be useful. Ibrahim?
Thank you. On the questions you posed, I think you yourself wittingly briefly answered most of those. So I don't think I need to chime in on those. On the issue of whether there's a possibility of UN playing a greater role, I think we have to bear in mind that the Taliban has achieved a military victory for all intents and purposes. So it will be the Taliban dictating in terms of what the new political order looks like. I think a lot of attention is paid to the fact that, to the assumption that the Taliban are doing all this, they are compromising and they're showing a reformist face because that's what the international community wants to see. But I think for the Taliban, domestic considerations have generally always trumped international considerations. They had been presenting themselves as the guardians of the rural constituency and had been trying to adopt policies that were somewhat in compliance, that was somewhat aligned with rural norms in Afghanistan. But over the past 20 years, the country has increasingly become urbanized, a population that has enjoyed freedom of expression, that has an understanding of what a government's duties are, what the role of service delivery is, what are the rights of citizens. And I think the fact that the way the Taliban took over, and especially their conduct in Kabul, while it might be temporary, we will have to wait and see, shows that the leadership had been thinking about the fact that the Afghan society has dramatically changed. I mean, my father tells me a story of when in our village, my grandfather lobbied to have a school for boys, not girls, by the way. The whole village was cursing at him and saying he's only bringing a school here because his son is interested and he doesn't want him to leave. So I mean, that was 60 years ago or 50 years ago. And now villages want education for their daughters. They know it's an important thing. It's a tool for advancement. And I think we generally tend to, in these international forums, we generally tend to neglect that that domestic dynamic that has an important implication on their policies. I did want to talk about the TTP, but I think I've already rambled on for too long, and I'm afraid I might stop making sense if I continue any longer.
I mean, just given your performance, you know, or rather your insights and what you've shared today, I think you rambling is a very low probability event in terms of our risk matrix. Ibrahim, brilliant again, and really, really deep, insightful, and valuable. Again, I'm so grateful that you're a part of this. To all of you for participating. I hope Shashank hasn't left us entirely. But Dr. Schroden, there's a specific question for you. So before I go to Amita, I'm actually going to come to you. SSKK, which is a fantastic name. Congrats. Is Pakistan now, given full takeover by the Taliban, more valuable to the US for CT cooperation or less? It's actually a really good question. So there's one more question that I'll take to Amita, and then we'll wrap up. But Dr. Schroden, why don't you deal with that one?
Well, that is a really good question. I'm not sure that I would characterize it as being more or less valuable. I mean, it has always been valuable as another actor to the United States in terms of counterterrorism interests in Afghanistan. I think the challenge will be the situation is just markedly different, and the U.S.-Pakistan relationship has been quite fraught over the last 20 years with lots of ups and downs, twos and fro's, gives and takes. It'll be very interesting to see going forward now, how that relationship unfolds now that the Pakistani, choice is effectively the government of Afghanistan. It, in some ways, that it might have the potential to reduce tensions between the U.S. and Pakistan with respect to the U.S. policy in Afghanistan. If that's how it unfolds, that could be a net positive for the relationship and for a lot of other aspects, with the U.S. position with respect to the region. So that would be my hope. But there's the possibility that it goes the other way too, which is that if the Taliban choose to be intransigent relative to the desires of the international community, and here I mean mostly the West, and if Pakistan defends them in international fora, then that could further strain the relationship between the U.S. and Pakistan as well. So, like a lot of things in Afghanistan these days, it could go down a multitude of paths, some positive, some negative from a U.S. perspective. And really, we're just going to have to wait and see how it unfolds.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Schroden. Again, deeply benefited from all of your insights, and I always do. I follow you religiously, and this was just a small trailer or teaser of all the insights that you offer. I'm going to say great things about you as well, Dr. Jadoon, just because they're all true. But before we sort of wrap up, Khalid Munir has a couple of comments. One, he clarified that the Dasu attack was by ETIM, which in and of itself, I think, is a real problem for Pakistan. But I think related to that, Khalid Munir asks, when the Taliban claim that they will not allow Afghanistan being used for activities against neighbors, so where will TTP, ETIM, IMU members go? I think that's like a question for the ages, and maybe you can offer some insights on that, Dr. Jadoon, before we wrap up.
Okay, thank you. So I think, and I don't know if our I guess the audience member has any additional information, but as far as I know, I think there are suspicions that the Dasu attack had cooperation between the Pakistani Taliban and ETIM, which is actually even more worrisome, right? But that's expected. That's how Pakistani Taliban has operated. That's how it's trying to make a comeback. In terms of where all these militants will go, if Afghanistan does not allow them to exist, I don't think the Afghan Taliban will start pushing out militants. I don't think they have the capacity to do this, and I don't think it serves them well politically because a lot of these fighters have supported the jihad in Afghanistan. What they may try and do, and we've heard some reports of the Afghan Taliban attempting to do this, is have any foreign fighters be registered. And I think there have been some recent tensions between Pakistani Taliban and the Afghan Taliban where, the Taliban have tried to control TTP. I think it's not going to be that easy again for the Afghan Taliban to just push out these militants because they're ethnically connected. They're connected through marriages. They have relationships with civilian populations on both sides of the border. My guess is that based on historic trends, Balochistan and the Fatah regions, especially closest to the borders, those are the areas where we're likely to see a concentration of militants, but especially Balochistan, because we have seen an uptick in activity in there by various groups. It's also one of the regions which Pakistan has really struggled with to govern. So my prediction is that it will be along, we can see increased militancy along the border area and also in Balochistan.
Dr. Amira Jadoon, Dr. Jonathan Schroden, Ibrahim Bahiz, Shashank Joshi, all four of you, so grateful that you guys made time. Everything that you said was insightful and deep. I want to recognize, I think especially Ibrahim, your contribution towards the end there, the idea that these conversations need to be more anchored and more rooted in the people of Afghanistan, not just those that have left or that are most visible, but also those that are maybe the silent majority that we don't see. And so I deeply appreciate it, and I hope that you'll come back when we ask you to come back, which will be very soon. so we can talk more about these issues for all of you. So grateful. I just finally want to point out that in a couple of days on Friday at exactly the same time, we're going to do another roundtable, and this one is going to be on more of a humanitarian perspective. We're going to talk about the brain drain and the exodus of Afghan talent out of the so-called emirate. And we have a fantastic panel. I hope I'm able to say at the end of it as good as this one, but this one was really special. So once again, Ibrahim Bahiz, Jonathan Chauvin, Amira Jadoon, and Shashank Joshi, thank you. And thanks to all the folks that tuned in, asked questions, left comments, and tried to learn more about this. We keep trying to learn with all of you, and it's been a real joy and pleasure. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much for inviting us.